People come from all walks of life. They all have lives they lead. Any and all are welcome here to come and chat with me.
Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Well, you know, now that the election's been called, the politicians are out there, maybe they're canvassing or putting up their signs, whatever they do, hoping that you will vote for them. Now, it just so happens that my guest today is into politics. Ladies and gentlemen, representing the People's Party of Canada, Rob Bogunovic.
Thank you.
So, welcome to the show,
Thank
first
you.
of all. Now, I hope you got your name right.
Yeah, Rob Bogunovic.
Bogunovic. I did ask you right
Yep.
before, and then I get all nervous, and I think, oh my gosh, did I mispronounce it is what I want to say. So because I didn't know much about the party to begin with, I did look it up. So it's a fairly new party, correct?
Yeah, it emerged about 1 year after Maxime Bernier ran for the leadership of the Conservative Party. He lost in a very close and contested battle with Andrew Scheer. 1 year later, he left the party because he saw that despite having almost 50% of the delegate vote, very little of his platform, in fact, hardly anything in his platform was being respected by the Conservative leader. He felt that the Conservative Party had become intellectually and morally bankrupt. So he left in 2018, and that gave us about 1 year to try and assemble a party and get candidates across the country, building up the electoral district associations and registering, doing all the paperwork, Election Canada, finding candidates. And in 2019 was our first election. We got, we didn't do as well in the vote as we wanted, based on what some of the polls had suggested we might do. But for a party that was 1 year old, it was actually a really good showing. I think we got our expectations up when we saw how well we were organizing, and then the actual result was a little discouraging, but I would not have been discouraged by the result had that been the prediction when their party was formed in 2018. 300,000 people across Canada voted for us. A lot of individuals were afraid to split the vote. But they supported our agenda. And yeah, so we've been moving forward since.
So were you involved with politics prior to that?
Not really. I'm always taught about politics. I've always studied politics. Going back to when I was in high school, I was very interested in the various political battles that were taking place and followed it very closely. I teach social studies and social justice, so that requires me to be well versed on the issues. But the first time I ever became actively involved with a political party would have been with the People's Party. Prior to that, I've been all over the electoral map because I tend to vote for the best candidate and look at the politics of the party, whether or not there's things that I can support, cannot support. But I've always sort of drifted to where I think the best candidate is. And so over my political life, I voted Green Party, NDP, Conservative, Liberal, at provincial and federal levels. There was 1 year I wanted to be able to vote for Gilles Duceppe in the Bloc Québécois because I thought he was the best leader up on the platform, but of course they don't run candidates outside of Quebec.
Right.
So it's always been what I look for. Who do I think I can trust? Who do I think is presenting the best vision for Canada? And that does shift, right?
Yes.
Sometimes a party just doesn't seem to be where I think Canada needs to be. But with Maxime Bernier, he's presented one vision. His platform did not change from 2019 to today.
Okay.
Most of the other parties, their platforms shift pretty dramatically. But what he presents is a classical liberal vision. And that is, looking at the liberalism, the fundamental freedoms and charter rights notions of John Locke, as well as the free market capitalist notions that were put forth by Adam Smith. And those seem to be what anchors the ideology of our party. And we are not looking to try and move what we promise Canadians. What we want to be is present a consistent vision. This is what the party is. This is what the party offers.
One of the things I've heard people say, which really always boggles my mind, is they won't vote for a party if they don't think they're going to win.
Yeah.
And I always think, well, how could they possibly win if too many people think that way?
And that is the game that we see the big two parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, they both play that game. They seem to want to lock up the whole electoral process, and a lot of people buy into that. In Chilliwack Hope, the most consistent argument we hear from the Conservatives overwhelmingly is don't split the vote, don't split the vote. In the last election, Mark Straw won, more votes than the Liberals, the NDP, and the Green Party combined. Right. And yet what we heard everywhere was don't split the vote. But we also heard, we like your platform, we like your leader, we like your party, we like you. Don't split the vote, right?
Yeah.
And to me, we're not hearing Conservatives say they don't like our platform. We're saying that they wish our platform was their platform. They often say they wish our leader was their leader. Liberals who have woken up to the fact that Trudeau is an illiberal prime minister, that he's trampling upon the fundamental rights and freedoms of Canadians in a way that I really don't think Pierre Trudeau would have approved in any way. Those Liberals, I think, are also looking at the one party on the landscape that is really to stand up and defend our charter rights and our freedoms. And if enough Liberals and Conservatives looked at our platform and voted their values, I think we would do really well. But getting people to vote their values is tough.
Well, yeah, why is that? Do you have any idea?
Some of it, I think, is just that so much of politics is driven by fear.
Right.
And so many people make the appeal to fear, and this is because fear will motivate individuals.
Right.
And so you have this system where the Liberals will say, you need to vote for us or O'Toole gets in. And of course they paint O'Toole as alt-right, radical, extremist, and of course anyone on the Conservative side of the spectrum looks at that and is mystified that that's how they paint him. Right. We find that he's way too liberal and way too much chasing after the polls. And then of course the Conservatives, they're always saying Trudeau is going to be the end of Canada, which unfortunately might well be true, except that they're not offering a vision that will reverse the course.
Right.
So we're in a free fall, we're running towards a cliff, we're in a lot of trouble, but they're not really reversing course. They seem to be trying to get people to say, Trudeau is worse, so accept us anyways,
right.
Even though you might look at what we're offering and not see the solutions that Canada needs. That's a tough one, and so people wind up being locked into fear narratives. And I'm not going to suggest that the People's Party doesn't use the language as well, because there's a lot to be fearful, right?
Yeah, yes, we're in that time.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Now let's talk about a little bit more specifics about the platform. Now, we have the Indigenous situation, like with the residential school situation, all of these coming up. And what does your party, what do they have to say about that, about those issues?
Yeah. And when I say that the People's Party presents a consistent political ideology, it is consistent pretty much on every issue. Okay. And so you could easily predict where we would land on an issue like Indigenous rights. Where we land is where we land for all the other issues connected to Canadian people, giving the people the power to govern themselves. We want to decentralize the federal authorities in the areas where they have been invading into provincial and municipal jurisdictions. We don't believe that you should be constantly holding your hand out to the federal government and trying to get politicians in Ottawa and Ontario and in Quebec to understand the issues in Chilliwack Hope. So with the First Nations communities have been the most micromanaged at the federal level of any group of Canadians, and we've seen the result. You want to see the difference between community and provincial government versus federal government. Our provincial day school system versus residential schools is a perfect example of the problem. So what we want to do with First Nations communities and all communities is give them the resources so that they can govern themselves with the proper accountability measures, govern themselves within the framework of our Canadian laws without micromanaging them, so that they don't have to get permission. They don't need to knock on the doors and lobby for funding. They basically would have the tax resources. So the People's Party wants to take the existing money that is already being spent to support First Nations communities, and we want to make sure that that money is essentially being managed directly by the First Nations themselves as they deal with what their priorities are. If a community's priority is, to provide clean drinking water, then they should have the funding and the means to look after that themselves, and the accountability would then reside with them as well.
Right, yeah, I like hearing that. I'm just thinking about so some of the things that I've heard, and I'm just going to stick with the Indigenous for a little bit, is that like it's Ottawa decides who gets status and who doesn't. Like simple things like that, which is not simple really, but you know what I mean? Like something like that is so strange to me.
And it was because status involved what rights you got under, the federal jurisdiction.
Right,
so
right.
Since there was money attached, then they would say, well, we recognize status versus we recognize not status. And it does create a lot of problems for bands when they're trying to say, well, this is an individual. We know their historical connections. They were living within our lands. They had strong connections to our groups. And yet they don't have status because, let's say, some paperwork got lost, they never got registered, or in many cases, let's say they married, right, and lost their status. Right. And there was lots of those problems. Many of the first real legal victories of the First Nations communities in the court concerned this status issue, especially for women.
Right.
So, yeah, it's unfortunate because they attach the money and then the bands aren't able to say, well, this person belongs and that person doesn't. There could be some challenges if you give all that process control over to the bands where perhaps some bands would be disenfranchising individuals for whatever reason. It could be an interesting weapon or tool that could be used, almost a bully potential opposition. You'd have to make sure that there's none of that, right? That you can't just defranchise or destatify a person just because, let's say, they're a political rival. Mm-hmm. But as far as granting status, I think much more control ought to be in the hands of the First Nations.
Right. Okay. Now, switching the topic, let's talk about the environment, which is a huge concern, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what would your party do, let's just say about the fires, why hasn't the military been brought in or whatever? What are your thoughts on those situations?
Yeah, ultimately when you are dealing with communities at risk, you want to mobilize all the resources that are available. As far as fires themselves, Mother Nature doesn't look at fires as being a bad thing. Right. We've had a forest management practice, for a long time that has treated fires as the enemy. And for good reason, they do property damage, but they are part of the natural cycle. And we'll have, bad fire seasons. Now, some individuals will like to, say, we have unprecedented fires. That's just not true. The acreages burned back in the 1920s and 1930s was much higher than what we're seeing now. So it's just that it's a question of how far back does our memory go. Mm-hmm. And then again, we have more people living in those areas that are being affected by the fire. So that does make it an unprecedented situation in that it's affecting more people. But it's a challenge. Right. And ultimately, we need to make sure that we're talking to the individuals most trained in the governing of a forest, who understand the nature of the life cycles of a forest and the part that fire plays in that cycle, and make sure that they're setting sound policy. But we also need to make sure that we're looking at which communities are most vulnerable and how we can protect them. Fort McMurray it could have been protected if they had, created fire shields, if they had burned off with control burns the area surrounding it, but regulations actually stopped them from doing that. This was one of the things that also led to a lot more of the forest fires in Australia, last year. Yeah. A lot of it was driven by policies that prevented the farmers from taking the measures that they normally would have taken, and then wildfires got out of hand. So we have to be aware that it's a complicated situation. Right. And give the individuals living in those communities the ability to actually take the measures they know work.
And one of the things that I've heard is that we're having more forest fires because our temperatures are rising or staying high for a longer period of time. Like I don't remember anything being as hot as it was this summer, mm-hmm. but that may have been in the past. I don't know.
Yeah, if you study the issue, and it's always a question of, are you looking at the graphs being produced by the IPCC in 1990 versus the graphs that are being produced today, because they're not the same, right? They've adjusted the pass downward while heightening, the temperatures in the present, and they claim that their models justify that. If you take a look at the temperature data, we had really hot temperatures in the 1920s, 1930s. We had a succession of environmental catastrophes in the 1920s and 1930s that we simply do not see parallels to today. Now, some of that is because we have, better protections like
Sure.
flood control and all the rest of it. But we tend to think that everything right now is climate emergency,
Yes.
that we haven't seen anything like this. Except if you study history, that's just not true.
Right, yeah.
My training is geography and history. Climate science is a subfield of geography. It's really the study of weather over time. And so when you've studied history and geography and then you see the kinds of things that people are saying, you know that there's something that doesn't align. The temperature graphs that NASA puts out don't emphasize that the 1930s were absolutely brutal in their temperature.
Oh yeah, one of the things talking about the climate. One of the things that people don't pay attention to is like this has been the hottest since. They always say since, but nobody pays attention to that since 1920 or whatever.
Yeah, and so we have two problems that are going there. First of all, when we're dealing with Chilliwack, if you're looking at hottest temperature, coldest temperature, daytime, nighttime, wettest, windiest, you got 6 data points. Over 365 days, you're now dealing with, about 2,000 different records that could be broken in the course of a year, right? Not counting that you might have warmest months, coldest months, that sort of thing. So we've added a few more into it, and we only have a record that goes back about maybe 100 years in Chilliwack. So in any given year, you would expect 20 records to be broken.
Right.
And yet they report about a record falling, like, wow, this is really, unparalleled. And then they often will say, right, the warmest since 1956, claiming that's a record. Okay, so now because you've extended the data points, you can potentially have 40 or 50 records falling in the course of a given year. That's the first problem. Second problem is, and this is a bigger issue for places like Vancouver or Paris or, New York, is we report about how this is the warmest temperature they've ever had. They don't factor in the urban heat island effect. And so, Paris has record temperature. Well, Paris also has record concrete, right? More concrete, more generation of heat, and the temperature is being set at a thermometer that's basically at the airport, right? So compare that to 1911 Paris, and something just doesn't line up. And so if you factor out the urban heat island effect, if you make sure you're always dealing with the thermometers that are basically in the rural areas, that creates a very different picture. And so you're going to have a lot of claims. Now, there's not really much dispute in the scientific community that we have had a warming, right, over the last 150 years because we've come out of a little ice age. And it's a good thing we've come out of a little ice age. That warming is maybe about 1 degree Celsius. We suffered a lot of bad weather and bad weather events under a little ice age. We certainly don't want to return to that. But they then go beyond that and they say it's only been carbon dioxide that's driving it. I look at, rainforest deforestation as being a significant cause of climate change. Madagascar is being hit heavily right now by climate change. They destroyed 90% of their rainforest. That's probably vastly more significant to what's going on in Madagascar than anything going on with carbon dioxide. And that somehow is constantly left out of the discussion. And there are other things that have to be factored into it. Climate is complicated. That's why the models that have been put forth and that they keep relying upon, most of them get it completely wrong because there's always a factor or two that they fail to consider. And when you take a look at which model has been the most predictive, which is, I believe, the Russian model on climate, it doesn't predict the dire situation moving forward that the alarmists liked to call upon. Now, the alarmists could be right. My problem with the alarmists isn't that, I know what the future will be any better than they do. They speak with such assurance that they know what the future will be and that what's happening right now, but then when they present what's happening right now, that's where they make their errors. A classic example, sea level rise. They will tell you that we're in a crisis of sea level rise right now, that seas are rising rapidly right now. The reality is they're not. In Vancouver, it's rising at 0.3 millimeters a year, a rate that's been steady for a century. That means in a century, we'd see about 3 centimeters of sea level rise. Very, very, very manageable. In New York, it's about 2.8 millimeters per year. Going back over 100 years, that the battery, they've been taking it by tide gauges, they will present an image of the Statue of Liberty underwater.
Yeah.
You see this on National Geographic. Yeah. It will take 10,000 years for salt water to touch the foot of the Statue of Liberty at 2.8 millimeters, which is the steady rate. Wow. Greta Thunberg says that her country is threatened by sea level rise. The seas are retreating. Why? Isostasy causes the land to be rising. And so in Stockholm, it's actually, the sea is retreating about 3.3 millimeters per year. It's a complicated issue because the land and the sea are both moving. And sometimes certain tide gauges will show something very bizarre, like Manila. Manila, their tide gauge shows that it was going at a straight line and then suddenly escalated. But the escalation happened in the 1960s. When temperatures were going in the wrong direction. Okay. It probably had absolutely nothing to do with temperature. It probably had to do with the fact that maybe they were draining their aquifer and causing the land to shift down, and that would cause the tide gauge to suddenly, produce this anomaly. Right. But then you take that and you throw that in with all the other tide gauges that are flat lines, and you can create the appearance that, something's shifting upwards. But take a look at Seattle, Vancouver, Victoria, Halifax, New York, Los Angeles, Honolulu, Sydney, any major, city on a coast, and look at their tide gauge, and you will see it's a straight line, there's been no escalation, and it's not alarming. Where's the fear coming from? Right. I can't say what sea level is going to do 20 or 30 years from now. I can tell you that what they're claiming today is wrong.
Wow. Okay? This is so fascinating. And on that note, we're going to end it because we're out of time, but I really enjoyed this. This was very informative. Listen, I hope you found it informative too. I hope you enjoyed listening to what Rob Bogunovic, I just get names wrong all the time, has to say, and I hope you'll get out there and vote, as everybody should do. And if let's just say people want to contact you, how would they do that?
The easiest way right now, we have an email set up. It's ROBBOGUNOVIC at FraserValleyPPC.ca. Right. They can also look me up on Facebook or Twitter, and it's always, Rob Bogunovic, the same spelling that I just gave. That's how they can look me up on those. And again, if you reach out to the EDA, they'll put you in contact with me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you.
And thank you for watching. Hope to see you next time. Until then, everybody, peace out. Even though you can't see it, I'm not high enough. Peace out.
A sense of community, Chilliwack's a place to be. A sense of community where you're free. Rolling through the mountains, rolling through the valley, rolling through paradise with me. It's multicultural, you're sure to see it all. Chilliwack's a place to be, you'll see. Come party in the park, go dancing after dark. Chilliwack's a place to be, you'll see.